Welcome, everyone. My name is Kaliroi Stavrianou, and on behalf of Global Clinical Engineering Alliance, I'm happy to moderate this series of webinars that aim to educate, promote collaboration, and information exchange about healthcare technology, engineering, and patients' outcomes. The webinars are recorded, archived, and also live streamed on Facebook. Following the completion of the webinar, the recording material will be accessible on our website. Please note that at the bottom of the screen, you have a Q&A button where you can submit questions and comments to the faculty that will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. In addition, for posting general comments, there is an option of the chat box for audience interaction. Today's webinar is the second in the series with title Project Management for the BOSS Executive Sponsor. Dr. Yodim David, Interim President of GCEA, I give you the floor to introduce the presenter.
Thank you, Kaliroi. It's a pleasure to be with you on this series and continue the training and education of clinical engineers all over the world. I'm looking forward to this webinar today for two main reasons. One is a project that is very important, but not covered well in the training of clinical engineers usually. And the second is that the speaker is so well qualified that I can't find anyone better to do and cover this topic. So with this, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Jonathan Gaev. Not only he is a great engineer, good scientist, and a good teacher, he's also a friend, and I'm proud to say that I feel privileged in that. He has over 30 years of management and engineering experience in the whole total life cycle technology management and planning and purchasing, or procurement as he referred to it. He did that over those many years from the US where he resides, plus Asia, Europe, as well as Latin America, where unfortunately he beat me in a dancing competition so easily that I just can't forget it. One day I will pay him back with a song that he cannot dance to. He is a certified clinical engineer, healthcare environmental manager, and a project management, perfect for today's project. He has training and master level degrees in biomedical engineering, and very appropriately in systems management. He has designed and managed a web-based product platform to support medical equipment maintenance. He had managed medical device evaluation and testing, both in the US and in Malaysia. He is well-known speakers on medical technology, technology management, and device safety. As a previous member of ECRI, he is well known in his methodology and particular skill of organization. This will play great for today's teaching and webinar. He is the founder of Applied Project Management, LLC, and he is devoting time to teaching project management and to assist those who need help with applying the methodology. The floor is yours, Jonathan. It's my honor.
Thank you.
Maybe before I let you free with your slide, I would like to just take a couple moments and offer the polling questions in the beginning, and we'll do that at the end as well. We will have several polling questions. One to start with, those two that you see on the screen, and then we'll come back during Jonathan's presentation with additional polling questions that would help you to digest the material, and we'll end up with a couple polling questions at the end for your entertainment. So on those two, the pre-webinar, how well are you familiar with the principle of project management methodology? Please choose one and do it right now, because in a few seconds we'll close the polling. And the second question, with regard to project management, do you think that clinical engineer should be trained about the methodology, only read about it? They must know how to apply it, and not that important for today's clinical engineers. That would help us to understand the attitude towards the subject. So please take 5 more seconds, mark your answers, and we'll see if we can share with you the results. Kaliroy, do we have results? Perfect. As you can see, half of you say that they have some basic understanding of the concept. 1/3 are using it routinely in their job. 1/10 are not familiar. And 6% says not at all. Regarding to the importance of the subject, what I see clearly is that almost 2/3 says that clinical engineers should be trained about the methodology. So much more power why Jonathan is here today for this purpose. And that about 40% must know how to apply it. Perfect background and understanding. I appreciate you joining us. And Jonathan, please, you have the microphone.
Thank you very much, Yadin, for that very warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be a clinical engineer. It's a pleasure to have worked with you for many, many years. And I'm really glad that you invited me here. And your poll confirmed what you and I had talked about privately, which is that project management is an important topic. I love project management, and I believe that learning about project management will help all of us in our work and in our life. I know that you in the audience come from many countries and many cultures, and you can be sure that the project management principles that we'll discuss today are applicable everywhere. Now, I've had the great pleasure of working with your colleagues from over 50 countries, and I'm sure that this material will be helpful to all of you when you adapt it to fit your work. And in this webinar, we'll talk about the role of the executive sponsor in project management. One of the main reasons that projects fail is due to issues related to the executive sponsor. In this webinar, you'll get an overview of project management. You'll learn the role of the executive sponsor, what to expect from a professionally run project, and how to help the project manager and team to be successful. Well, clinical engineering, we know, is full of projects. When I use the word project, I mean this is something that starts and ends, and it doesn't repeat very often. So let's look at a few examples. Maybe the security department calls us and says, you know, now we're expected to use a defibrillator, and we'd like to train our people. Could you help us to find a mannequin that would work with our defibrillator so we could do that training? You know that every few years, not few years, but every once in a while, we have to change our physiologic monitoring systems. We have to install new ones. I think we know that data security is very important. So we may be implementing a new data security policy. We will probably repeat in the implementation of that policy, but the very first time you do it, it's a project. And yes, we should clean up our shop from time to time. That's true. You know, projects are such a large part of our life in clinical engineering that I'm really surprised that they didn't teach us project management as part of our education in engineering school. Now, although all these projects seem very different, they have some things that are in common. And you might want to think, what do they have in common? And what management technique would be applicable to all of those? So I have a polling question now too. The first polling question, please, Kaliroy, asking about your experience. I'd like you to think, please, about your experience with your last project. So could we have the poll please. There we are. So just think about your last project. Did it start with a written schedule and budget? Was it completed on schedule? And was it completed within budget? So just those 3 questions. Please let me know what you think. We'll just take a couple seconds on that, and I'll be very interested to see the results. So let's see what everyone had to say. Great. I'm really glad to hear that it started with the schedule and budget. I have to say, where I work, that wasn't always the case. Sometimes things were late, and about half the time, 50-50, things were completed within budget. That's very interesting. Thank you. So as Yadin mentioned, I'm worked in clinical engineering for a long time, and I do have very specific project management experience. Actually, before I started in clinical engineering, I worked for RCA Corporation. That was back in the 1980s. Now I actually worked in advanced technology lab where we looked at computer vision, robotics, and expert systems. And they sent me to a 1-week training course, full-time for 1 week on project management. And that was pretty interesting. Those were very, very large projects. Later, in 2007, I became certified as a project management professional by the Project Management Institute. I'll tell you a little bit about that organization on our next slide. That's an important one in project management, so I'd like you to know it. I developed, my wife had been involved with a lot of, she was on the board for quite a few smaller nonprofits. She would tell me some of the problems they had with managing projects. So that's when I started Applied Project Management. I developed project management training courses, and I gave them to small businesses, and then later one-on-one to individuals. I even did give it at the company where I used to work at ECRI. There's no official definition of small project, but my definition is something that takes less than a year, costs less than about $75,000 US, and involves a team of about 12 people. So the Project Management Institute, this is the main formal authority on project management. And they're the ones that administer that project management professional exam and credential. They're an international organization, so I'm sure that wherever you are, there's a branch of PMI, the Project Management Institute, there for you. Now, in order to get their credential, that's about 1 or 2 semesters of study, and then every year, just like your clinical engineering certification, you have to have some ongoing education in order to maintain that credential. It's a nice credential to have. A lot of what they teach is particularly applicable for very large projects. So I'm focusing here and in my courses on the much smaller set of information that we use on a more daily basis for our projects. So I don't want to go too long or too far without defining some of the terms we're using. So a project, that's a one-time event, probably a rare event, could be big, it could be small. I gave some examples earlier. The executive sponsor, that's a word we use in project management. That's usually the boss who can assign you the project and assign resources to the project. So it's usually the person who can assign a budget, approve some spending, and assign people to the project. Now, the project manager, that's the person who's responsible for getting the job done. So the boss says to Jonathan, Jonathan, you're in charge of this new project. We want you to handle the installation of our new physiologic monitors. So I would have to create the project plan, assemble the project team, manage the team, and manage the budget and the schedule. Project management itself is a very specific set of practices and tools that we use to manage projects. I'll be talking to you about those practices during this talk. And the project team, these are people who are doing the actual work on the project. So, time for my next question, my next polling question. So I'll be asking, you've answered the questions about how your last project was. Let's look at the people in your organization. Do you think that many managers in your organization are trained in project management? And do you think many staff members are trained in project management? Be interesting to see. So we'll give this a few more seconds, and then it'll be interesting to see the results. Okay, so it looks like we're kind of in the fewer category in terms of bosses and employees or other staff having training in project management. That helps me. So let's take a look at this slide. Let's look at this graph on the right where it says inadequate sponsor support is a primary cause of project failure. So I look at these numbers in kind of a good and bad way. So the blue is what they call, is what Project Management Institute calls underperformers. This survey was done, by the way, in 2018. So that's pre-COVID. They do surveys regularly, but so much has changed during COVID and our situation now. I wanted to get a clear measure of how things were when life was normal, if it was. So when they say underperforming organization, they're talking about an organization where the majority of the staff and the majority of the management are not trained in project management. So it looks like that's a good match to where most of us come from. And so in that type of organization, 40% of the time, the sponsor is one of the main reasons that a project fails to meet schedule and budget. So perhaps that's the negative view. And then 17% of the time for what they call champion organizations, those are organizations where most of the people have project management training. Still 17% of the time, inadequate sponsor support is a primary cause of project failure. So my interpretation of this is kind of twofold. Number one, sponsors, bosses are part of the reason projects don't succeed. But look, with some training, that can cut project failures and that can cut this reason for project failure in half. So better boss gets us more successful projects. I think that's good news. So I think, why should we do this? What's the main benefit of project management? To me, it's happiness. But happiness means different things to different people. Now, we know what happens if a project doesn't run well. Patients and the clinicians aren't well served. So if they are well served, well, they get better results, they're happy. The administrator, they're probably more interested in schedule and budget especially, but there are only two ways to do things, the right way or twice. Twice costs more. So a well-managed project produces the results, frankly, at the lowest possible expense. Certainly, a well-run project is a lot more fun to work on for all members of the project team, and that includes engineers and technicians that are working on the project. You get to do a good job and feel good about it. So my goals for you during this talk is I hope that you will understand the roles and responsibilities of the boss or executive sponsor, project manager, and project team. I'm using a project word here, in scope. That's kind of what's in, what you're gonna do. I hope that this talk will help you to be a better executive sponsor. Now, out of scope, these are the things that I'm not trying to teach you here. This course really won't teach you how to be a project manager. It'll introduce the concepts, but I need at least 6 hours to actually teach you. And this course isn't going to tell you which project you should select, which one is important for your organization. So in order to present this information to you, I think about, what does the boss need to know? Well, if I'm managing a project, I have to know what a project is. So I have to know how a project progresses from start to finish and what the project manager does. If I don't know what a project manager does, well, how can I do a good job managing? And so I'll describe the project activities, the activities of the project manager, and the activities of the executive sponsor. So let's look at 4 phases of the project, and let's look at the role of the executive sponsor in each of those phases. I bolded some of the phases, the starting, initiating, organizing, and preparing, because frankly, I find those to be the most important phases of a project. So in the starting or initiating phase, the executive sponsor helps clarify the problem and helps obtain the resources needed to solve the problem. And I'll talk a little bit more about problems and problem solving later on. Then in organizing and preparing, well, the project manager prepares the plan, but the boss has to be able to check the project plan and approve it. Then once we have our plan, we go to work. The executing and controlling phase, the boss has to support the project manager. There are 2 main areas that tend to come up a lot: conflict resolution and change control. I'll talk about them. And then at the end, when we finish the project, it's important for the boss to help the project manager to properly close the project. And I'll certainly provide more detail. So I talked about the project and the project phases. Now I'm talking about project management. So it's simple. Plan your work, work your plan. So plan, do, check your work against the plan, and then take the actions that are required to get you back on schedule or back on your plan. I highlighted plan because a big part of project management is developing the plan. I'm going to speak about the plan in just a moment. I really think that it is a professional plan that sets project management apart from just regular management. There's all kinds of management out there. It's the professional plan that makes the real difference and makes something a professionally managed project. And when I say plan, I mean something very specific. I mean these 9 elements, and we'll talk about all of them. So the boss should expect the project manager to develop a plan that contains these elements, and I'll talk about them and what they are. Now, as I said, I want to improve your awareness. I had a course in histology, and that's the study of tissues. And when I started the course, they gave me a box of 100 slides. Frankly, these slides all looked alike to me. But then I learned what to look for in the slides. And by the end of the course, I could identify each of the slides as being distinct tissues. And my professor told me, what the mind doesn't know, the eye doesn't see. So it's kind of my goal to get you thinking and seeing like a project manager. So the way I want to do that is I want to start off with kind of a real life example that's not really clinical engineering. Yadin mentioned that I live in the United States. And from time to time, I like to go with my wife to Montreal in Canada. It's a beautiful place. And when we travel, we like to go to local restaurants. This is an example, time, of a local restaurant in Montreal. You see the menus just written there on the blackboard. And well, I'm a project manager, so let's make a project plan. I know that sounds funny, but project management, I really believe, is a life skill, not just a management skill. Dr. Edith Drury Brown is teaching project management to 3rd graders. Think about that. So like I say, project initiation, we want to go to a local restaurant. And then our scope statement. Well, we're going to go to the restaurant and that's the whole place. We're going to eat there. We're going to have drinks. We're going to have dessert, all at that restaurant. Schedule. Oh, I guess I should pick a time. Let's go tomorrow at 7 o'clock at night. Cost. Let's say $100 US. I better check the website. Maybe the first restaurant that I thought of is a lot more expensive than that, and I have to change. Remember that iteration picture I showed? Boy, we're only at step 4, and maybe we have to iterate something. Quality. Quality usually refers to what's being produced. So the restaurant should be paying attention to that, but I can contribute. If I say I want a steak medium rare, I should explain to the waiter what medium rare means to me. It might mean something different in that restaurant. Staffing, it's going to be me. Jonathan is going to be in charge of making these arrangements. Communications. Jonathan has learned that telling my wife that we're going to, that we have a reservation at 7:00 p.m. is not really helpful. What we really need to know is when do we leave the hotel? And then actually when I talk to her, she says, well, wait a minute, I need some time to get ready and, you know, maybe change our clothes after running around Montreal all day. So that communication step is pretty important. Then risk management. I like to have wine with my meal. Do they serve wine? I don't know, you couldn't have read that blackboard so quickly, but it was in French because in Montreal they speak French. So is that going to be a problem? Is someone going to be able to speak English to me? And how do I get there? I could drive, might be traffic, maybe it's better to take a subway. And do I need a reservation? Can I make a reservation? Procurement management, how do I pay the bill? Can I use my credit card from the US? Some restaurants in the US require cash, maybe in Canada too. Okay, this wasn't a technical challenge here, but what would happen if I skip part of this plan? Any of it, pick one. I don't make a reservation. I show up tomorrow at 7. Does that mean they'll have a table for me? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. The point I want to make is the issues don't go away just because you don't plan for them. So let's kind of keep that in mind. So why don't we plan? That's kind of a good question. And I think because most people think, well, if I have a job to do, the sooner I start, the sooner I finish. You know what? That's wrong. It's just wrong. The time we invest in planning saves project time. I know this is blurry. You can Google World House Construction Habitat for Humanity. They can build a house from scratch in 3.5 hours. It's a little blurry, but on the side, they have a lot of steps down to the minute. Some steps take 5 minutes, some takes 15 minutes. And because they planned it out so well, they can achieve this result. It's really amazing. So let's talk about that planning again. The sponsor should expect a preliminary and then a detailed plan during the initiation of the project. So in the beginning, the sponsor has a project idea. They may just have a problem, or the sponsor may have a solution. I want to give a word of warning to all sponsors or bosses. If you tell the project manager the solution, thinking is going to stop. That's not always good. I'll give you an example in the next slide. So after the sponsor calls the project manager into their office, the project manager should then develop a preliminary project plan, schedule, and budget. It's not final yet. And then they should talk, actually talk, have a conversation where the sponsor provides feedback, a reality check, and then approves the development of the detailed plan. Then, after the detailed plan has been completed, there may be some changes. The sponsor then gives a thumbs up or approval or terminates the project. If the project is not realistic for the budget and needs of the organization, it's better to stop than to continue. And then there will be a kickoff meeting to start the project. And the sponsor should attend that. Now, why don't we just jump in one step from the sponsor's initial idea to the full project plan? Developing a full project plan takes time, maybe 10% of the job. So if this job is going to take 100 hours, you might spend 10 hours planning. Remember, this is a quality project plan. So you don't want to spend a lot of time planning if your initial ideas are not correct. So I told you I would talk a little bit about problems versus solutions. This was an issue that came up in the United States 20 some years ago. Laser surgery was very popular and surgeons need lasers to perform certain types of surgery. So one solution, Obvious, just buy new lasers. What's the problem, Jonathan? Just do that. Where I used to work, ECRI, we would tell the client, no, we want to come in and do an inventory. And they would say, why would you do that? Well, because half the time we found that the hospital had a laser, somehow it wasn't on the inventories, they didn't have to buy it, or sometimes they had a laser that could be modified to meet the needs of that surgery. That would save them a lot of money. This happens all the time. So be careful if you're specifying the solution instead of just the problem, if you're the sponsor. Now, there's going to be a conversation about why the project manager is going to ask, why are we doing this project? Okay, and that can be an uncomfortable situation, especially the sponsor could say, well, geez, this is my idea. And they could be very sensitive about that. If you're the sponsor listening to this, please have some sympathy. Understanding why is really the key to leadership and generating enthusiasm for the project team. In fact, the team members should know why each of them was selected to be on the project. Yadin explained in the very beginning why I was selected to give this talk, because I have project management experience and clinical engineering experience. That why part is very important. If you ever have a chance, Google Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K. His TED Talk has over 58 million views and talks about the power of why. S-I-N-E-K, Simon Sinek. Didn't we see these people before? Yes, it's the exact same picture. But now we're going to call them stakeholders. You need to consider everyone who will be impacted by the project. And you'll need to have a plan to communicate with them. And you don't have a choice. If you don't communicate with them, believe me, the nurses, doctors, and administrators will choose to communicate with you. So remember that word that I used, scope. Scope is what's in and what's out on a project. And it's the second most, failing to manage the scope is the second most common reason for project failure. That's called scope creep. So for example, let's say we're installing a new physiologic monitoring system. So in scope, the clinical engineering department will receive the monitors, conduct incoming inspection, mount the monitors on the wall, and then test the monitor to be sure that it works. That's in. What's out? We're not going, clinical engineering is not taking responsibility to integrate with the electronic medical record. The IT department and vendor will do that. And clinical engineering is not going to train the nursing staff on how to use the monitor. The vendor will. In the old days, we did. So what's the point here? You can see that if some of these things that I've listed as out of scope become in scope, that'll really change the project plan. And this is another reason why clarifying the scope at the early stage of the project is so important. So as I said, the sponsor expects the project manager to develop a preliminary project plan that talks about the problem to be solved, the why, the business need, should identify a solution to the problem, clarify the scope, identify some of the key issues, especially staffing, any special resources, the key risks, and a preliminary budget and schedule. It's not final. That sounds like a lot, okay? But really, I have a template. Send me an email. I'll be happy to send this template to you. You could probably fill this out, you could probably fill out the parts that you need for the preliminary plan pretty quickly. I bet half an hour or an hour. Now, let's summarize the roles that we have in the initial project initiation. The executive sponsor defines the problem and the project manager defines a solution. The executive sponsor probably gives an initial scope or a general statement, and then the project manager is going to clarify the scope. The project manager is going to develop an initial plan and identify what resources are needed. And then the project executive sponsor or boss will review the plan. Now the boss may say, you know, based on this initial plan, we're going to do something different and we have to make changes. So we'll stop and we'll develop a new project. That's okay. Or the boss may say, yes, you're on the right track. Please perform. Please go make a detailed project plan. The project manager will do that, usually with a project team. And the boss understands that the project will change after the detailed planning, and the project manager will present that detailed plan to them. So we've talked about starting the project, the scope. Let's talk about the schedule. By the way, schedule and budget are usually developed at the same time. I'll show you why. So let's look at how the project manager develops the project schedule. It starts with something called the work breakdown structure. That's probably a new word. Let me show you what that means. It means if I say something like installing a monitoring system, that's too general. I can't estimate that too well. I have to break that project down into smaller pieces that can be estimated and monitored. I usually don't do that by myself as a project manager. I usually make that a team exercise. That also helps build some relationships in our team. So let's go back to going to dinner in Montreal. I might have to select a restaurant, pay a bill, eat, get there. At this point, we're not putting things in order. We're not giving a lot of detail. We just want to make sure we have the main things on there. Next step, I'll put them in order. Well, when I go to put them in order, I say, oh, I forgot something. There's getting ready. And what does getting ready really mean? I have to take a shower, change clothes, then I leave the hotel. Okay, so do you notice that things change once we have more detail? And that's why the detailed plan may have a different schedule and budget than the initial plan. So let's make a chart. I mean, having a plan, I have to present this to my boss so that she or he will understand it. So let's say I arrive at the hotel at 5:30 in the afternoon. And I talk to my wife, I kind of know her well. It's going to take her about an hour to get ready. So maybe she should have a shower first and I'll have it second because it only takes me half an hour. Then a half an hour to travel to the restaurant. Then we eat dinner, let's say an hour and a half, then travel back to the hotel half an hour. That's my whole project. Now, you notice those items in red, I call them the critical path. That means if any of those are late, the next thing is late. So if we're late getting ready, then we're going to leave late to the restaurant. We're going to arrive late. Frankly, our time to eat dinner is probably the same, but could have a problem if I have a reservation and I miss it. By the way, look at the total time for this project. It's about 3.5 hours. Eating, the actual part that I want to do, that's only 40% of the project time. Isn't that interesting? When you do a project, sometimes the thing that you're most thinking about isn't actually the thing that takes the most time. Let's talk about the budget. Now, there are only really 3 ways to estimate time or money. One way is from previous projects. We call that analogous estimating. If we have good data from previous projects, we could use that and say, hey, installing a physiologic monitoring system takes 4 months and $40,000 plus the equipment. Bottom up, this is what we tend to use most frequently. We look at each of those work breakdown structure activities, each of the little activities, estimate the time and cost, and then that produces our budget. Sometimes we can use a parametric estimate. So if I know the surface area of a wall, I know automatically the amount of paint. Now, I know that in some places, people don't look at labor as a cost, but it's nice to track it. That way you learn how you spend your time. Certainly, every organization cares about purchased goods and services. Many projects that I had, I could spend $20,000 in labor, no one cared. But if I had to buy a new light meter to test lights in the OR, and that cost a few $100s, everyone cared about that few $100. So you want to get ahead of that. Quality management is quite important. And I know engineers are perfectionists. I am one. Perfectionism is not quality. Quality is what the customer will pay for. So you have to understand very clearly, the project manager and the sponsor have to understand what a good job looks like. Now, sometimes there are specific standards you have to meet. In America, in Los Angeles, there are a lot of earthquakes. So if I'm putting something on the wall in Los Angeles, there are standards I need to meet that aren't the same as if I do that on the East Coast in Pennsylvania or New Jersey. And you want to do things right. You want to do each step correctly. Correcting something later costs 10 times more than getting it right the first time. Now, when we have a project, I keep using this word project instead of regular job. That means that these people who are working on the project probably still have their regular job. So the technicians you're using, they may still be responsible for fixing ultrasound equipment or taking care of vents or dialysis. And in addition, they're reporting to you as the project manager for that project. So there's always some tension there. People feel like they're being cut in two. And frankly, that's a major issue on most projects. So sponsor, sometimes the project manager is going to have to come to you and ask for help on that. Let's look at communications management. We'll spend a little time here. Now, when I say communications management, I mean these three things. Performance management, that's schedule and budget together. Sponsor is not just budget. Look, the project can be under budget because no one's working on it, and then you'll miss your schedule. So you want to look at both. You want to look at communication to the stakeholders. Those are the people involved in the project. You need to involve them in accordance with their needs. So I might have a daily meeting with my project team. I might meet with the executive sponsor once a week, or maybe just send him or her an email once a week. I may join a meeting with nursing once a month. You know, I have to adjust my communication to what they need. There are always changes to a project. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about change management. Now, you need a good communication plan because communication complexity goes up quickly. Think of it. If it's just you and me talking, there's only one communication channel. If there are 4 people talking, look at this box. There are actually 6 channels. I'm talking to engineers. I couldn't go through this entire talk without providing a formula. So I provided one here. The number of channels is 1/2 times the number of people times the number of people minus 1. So you can see it's a square, and that's why this goes up quickly. It's not linear. In America, we have an expression. We want to drive the bus, not get run over by the bus. So that's why we want a very good communications plan. Now, a change management plan. First of all, change requests are written. I remember one customer, it was an external customer. He didn't work for my company, and I was doing a job for him, a pretty big one. And I said, Steve, you and I are going to talk very often about the project, but I'm going to continue to do the work that I did just according to the plan that you approved. So if you want me to do something different, you have to send me an email saying change request, because I don't want a misunderstanding on this. You want to document any change, even if the change doesn't cost money, even if it doesn't make you late. Now, for the sponsors, you want to decide at the start of the project who can approve changes, or you will slow things down. Don't do that. So as a sponsor, tell the project manager up to $500 or up to 50 hours, do what you want. I don't want to slow you down. I trust you. Now, as a project manager, when I hear change, I think of this triple constraint: scope, time, and cost. So if you add to the scope, oh, you want me to not only install the monitor, you want me to do training, that's going to take more time and it's going to cost more. Oh, you want everything done quickly? Yes, I can do that. That's going to cost more because you've cut my time down. Now I need priority delivery. So as a project manager, you keep these 3 things, scope, time, and cost, on your mind all the time. For Americans in the audience, take a dollar bill out of your pocket and look at the back. You'll see this triangle there. It's that important. So back to my restaurant. If I'm there and we buy a bottle of champagne to celebrate, well, you know, that's going to throw my budget off a little bit. And well, if I finish the champagne, I might as well have a brandy too while I'm at it. That's how we go That's how scope creeps, and that's how we go over our budget. Let's look at what we can do about risk. It's interesting. There are only 4 things we can do. Isn't that neat? I could accept the risk. So I accept I'm eating local food at a local restaurant. I might like it, I might not. I could avoid the risk by changing the plan. We'll go to McDonald's in Montreal. I know what McDonald's is. They're pretty consistent. I know what that's going to be like. I could transfer the responsibility for picking this restaurant. So I could ask the hotel for a recommendation. That's not a bad idea because the person at the hotel has to see me the next day. So they tend to try to give a decent recommendation. Or I could mitigate the risk, which is to reduce the probability of the bad thing. So I know my wife and I like Italian food. Italian restaurants are pretty consistent. So I could find an Italian restaurant in Montreal. May not be local food, but it reduces the chance that I'm going to get something that I don't like. Pretty interesting, huh? Just these 4 different ways to address risk. Procurement management. It's not part of all projects. It wasn't part of a lot of mine, but if you were buying something, you want to understand the procedure in your organization. There may be some policies. When I worked at RCA, I needed 3 quotes for everything that I bought. So you want to know what documentation is required. If you're working for a government or government agency, or you're handling public money, believe me, that's important. Also in our work, we're not ordering simple things off Amazon. I've been burned because I thought a particular type of ultrasound fluid that I needed for my Phantom I could get right away, but it turned out they only made it 3 times a year. And yes, I missed the last deadline. Hate it when that happens. So we finished the plan. It's time to run the project. So what is the executive sponsor's role when the project manager's running the project? Well, the executive sponsor wants to pay attention to the status. Talk about that on the next slide. Always wants to ask, are there changes? Those risks that you mentioned in the preliminary plan, are we monitoring them? And watch for people getting pulled off the project. Listen for that. Now, project status is like a traffic light. Everywhere in the world, traffic lights go green, yellow, red. Okay, a well-managed project, stuff doesn't go from green to red. So green means everything's okay. If I notice I'm having a problem, I may say to the boss, I notice I'm having a problem in an area. We thought it was easy to mount these things on our wall. Turns out it's harder than we think. I'm talking to facilities about it. I've got a plan. I'll let you know if that slows things down or not. But things shouldn't, it's very rare, things should not go from everything's fine to I'm late. That's not great management. Closing the project. When the project is done, there's a big temptation for everyone to just run far and fast and get caught up with the other things. Executive sponsor, don't let the team run away. Take a breath. First of all, make sure you're done. Make sure you really did what you said. Give the team the time to finalize and store their project documents, and then conduct a lessons learned review. That might be a new term for some of you. Now, in the lessons learned review, the executive sponsor is not there. Okay, by this time, this is the end of the project. The project manager and their team should have good enough trust that they can have a frank conversation about what went right, what went wrong, and what would we do differently now that we've been through the project. So just those 3 questions, no blame. You're not telling someone they did a bad job, you're just trying to learn. That's really important. And document these lessons learned. So almost there, we're wrapping up. So how would we introduce project management? Well, first of all, start small, start with small projects, then do more. I would start with 2 things. I would start with lessons learned meetings, and I would start by using the project planning template. And by the way, this isn't just for projects. These techniques that I'm talking about, they actually apply to regular work. Every time I documented a current work process, I found steps that could be eliminated and ways to do things better. I really believe that project management thinking is very useful thinking. It helps you get ahead of issues. It helps in your mind create organization and proactive thinking. These are some books that I like. Well, two I like, one I don't. Gary Herkin's book on project management, I know that's 2014. It's a good book. He doesn't use a lot of project management jargon. He's just trying to teach you how to run a project. Same thing for Sandra's book. It's in its 3rd edition. So people have been liking that and they kept printing it. Now, the Project Management Institute does have a very big, thick book called A Guide to Project Management. It's not a lot of fun to read, but I do have to mention it because it is the main reference for our work in project management. It's updated every few years. So let's summarize what we've learned about project management. Projects are rare events, one-time events maybe. They have a start and they have a finish. Even though it looks like a line, we know there's iteration. We have to develop a plan, follow our plan, check to make sure we're working on plan, then take action. Believe me, communication is a very important part of project management. And if there's any change, you want to think in your mind, scope, time, cost. What changed and how did it affect the other two? Now, as an executive sponsor, you need to look for certain skills for your project manager. Now that we've talked about project management, you should have a better idea of that. Obviously, you need someone who's organized. Communication is a very important part. Until you're finished, you haven't finished. So all you're doing is communicating. And conflict resolution, usually in terms of schedules, priorities, that's all going to be a big part of what a project manager does. So let's summarize. For the executive sponsor, you should help the project manager to get off to a good start. Clearly communicate the business purpose, the why. Why are we doing this project? Clearly communicate what the problem is that we want to solve and insist on getting a good plan. But understand that project management is iterative. There will be changes to the plan, and once the project starts, there will be changes to the project. From the project manager, you should expect a good plan with a realistic schedule and budget. That schedule and budget may be different than what you wanted, but a good project manager produces a realistic schedule and budget. The good project manager communicates regularly and lets you know about changes. And like I said, ask for help when they need it. So, last polling question for me. What do you think? Do you think your team members would benefit from project management training? Yes or no? Only one slide after this. I'm on the edge of my seat. Wow, that answers the question. Well, I'm glad to see that. I believe that too. I really believe that project management is something very, very important. You know, I have a course where I teach that. Send me an email with any questions you have about project management. I have a QR code. You can kind of click and get to my site right now. Send me an email. I'll send you the template. You know what? You could take as your very first project management exercise that lessons learned. Tell me, Jonathan, this is what you did right in your talk. This is what you did wrong. Now that I've had your talk, this is what you should have done differently. You won't hurt my feelings. You'd be helping me. Thanks. I really appreciate everyone's time and attention today. I really enjoy this topic and really believe that project management will help you. So I hope we have some time left for questions. And I think I should leave a little bit of time after that for some closing remarks from our organization. Again, thank you, Yadin. Thank all of you for giving me the chance to spend this time with you today.
Jonathan, impressive. I learned myself so much, I'm embarrassed to admit. This is beautifully done on such a wide subject. You selected so nicely how to guide individual to start few steps, small project, as you said, and understanding what's the relationship between the sponsor and the project manager. That was clearly delivered. I was
Thank you.
attending the chat box. Several people, Bruce, Meladen, Rosanna, Khalil, all reflected similar feedback about how much they enjoy your good organized presentation.
Thank
There
you.
also a question in the Q&A box that I took liberty to respond while you're talking and actually covering the subject. But among the email that came through, the several requested a copy of the template.
Sure.
And I put your email in the chat box so they can direct the request to you as you express in the closing remarks. Let me, before I pose some questions, let me just ask the final polling questions for the webinar. If you can, there are two of them, if you can take the time and tell us how much you are familiar with the principle of project management methodology at the end of the webinar. And did you find this webinar to be very useful, interesting, but not that useful? Maybe you don't like Montreal, I don't know. Not sure if I will ever need to use this knowledge because I don't like Italian restaurants. And I enjoyed Jonathan Gaev's presentation and learned a lot. So if you can take a moment, somebody asked, where is here? I'm going to put your email again because we just have a question from Sam. Sam, I put it in the chat box, the email again. And Kaliroy, can you show us the results, please? I know some basic concept, over half of the people, and learn today and feel comfortable about 40%. Great. On the second question, they seem like that you increase the comfort level by showing that the material understood and it's going to be useful, and that at least 1/3 really enjoy your presentation and learn the material. So with that, let me ask you something that came up in the chat box often. If the sponsor is telling you, which often happen, look, you're going to hang those monitors and the IT will do the interface to the EMR, the vendor will do the integration and so on. But I want you also to make sure that the lights are not blocking the monitors, something that was not in the scope before. In other words, a small project got changed and you are just part of it. How do you go about and deal with it?
That's a good point. One of the things, change is not always bad, and changing the scope and changing the budget, that's not always bad. We just have to be aware of what we're doing and why. For example, in the example you gave, we want to have a successful result. If we forgot to properly consider the lights so that the monitor could be viewed appropriately by clinical staff, but that's a big omission. You know, we have to solve that. We don't have a choice. We can't just say, well, I'm going to stick to my guns and do it the way I had it planned. So sometimes when scope changes, that's something that's quite appropriate and something we have to do. At least by having the plan, we know that our initial budget had a certain time and a certain cost. And now we've gone over and we know how much we've gone over and why. You know, project management isn't magic. You know, 9 women in 1 month doesn't make a baby. We need 1 woman in 9 months. So sometimes reality sneaks up on us and we have to recognize it. I still think we're better off with a plan than with no plan. Remember that stakeholder analysis I talked about earlier?
Mhm.
Maybe if I really talked to the nurses and others, I would have gotten some feedback from them early on to say, you know, the last time you guys did this, it really wasn't right, and this really didn't look good. And I'd like you to move the whiteboard in the meantime, because I don't like the way that is going to be with the monitor. So you can take that into consideration and say, well, maybe I should move the whiteboards too.
Okay.
But that stakeholder analysis step in the beginning is very important. That's one way to catch problems.
Okay. I have another question, and that's relating directly to clinical engineering in the audience that may be saying, I now understand the basic of the process, the roles and responsibility, but where can I find practical tools I can take it and use immediately?
Okay, so if we're talking about practical tools for scheduling, for example, just a sec, we're talking about practical tools for scheduling, then there are a couple of choices. One choice is Microsoft Project is kind of the default tool for project management scheduling. You can make a simple schedule with Excel. Frankly, that's what I used to do the, that's what I used to make the chart that you saw. And if you're really doing a lot of project management, there are environments like WorkZone that provide, there are environments like WorkZone that enable an integration with email and other systems. So if someone, you know, wants to address that issue more strongly, I'd be very happy to talk to them on a more personal basis. But in summary, you have Excel. You can Google free add-ins to Excel. There are some free add-ins that make Gantt charts. And then you have tools like WorkZone, WORKZONE, that provide an overall environment for project management, including document management, which is quite important.
And if we would like to start with a small project in maybe the technology management program, something with the maintenance, what would you suggest that the steps should be?
I think the first step is to take a quick look at the project planning template. Look at those 9 steps in the project plan. Make sure that the scope is very clearly described. That's usually, it sounds so easy, but that's usually where things go amiss. And any mistakes in the scope are really going to hurt you later. As I mentioned, talking to stakeholders is a very important step. I like to ask 2 questions. I'd like to say, have we done this before? And then usually people will say, well, I haven't done exactly this before. I say, okay, have we done anything similar before? And what were the results? So maybe I didn't implement a new HR policy before, but I implemented some other privacy policy or something like that before. And then get people to talk. I would really encourage face-to-face if we can do it, a Zoom call if we can't, but not just email. People have to discuss these things. So in summary, work through those 9 steps of project management. Just take a little bit of time on each of them to think. The stakeholder analysis, I think, is very important. That gets you out of a lot of trouble, and be very clear about your scope.
Great. Thank you. You are very kind with your time. Questions are still floating through both the Q&A box that you can take, Jonathan, as well as the chat box. I'm trying to keep up with it, but I also respect the time that you gave us. What I would like to make clear is that Jonathan is starting a private enterprise business, and his business is going to focus exactly on what he's trying to teach us today, and did such a great job. And if you ever need help, no matter what size of help, please, you have the email for Jonathan posted. We will have this webinar video posted. It is being recorded. The Q&A would be included, and the responses to the question will be included as well. So the slide deck will be there, and you can do it at your leisure and invite other members of your department to watch it with you together. So with that, I would like to thank you very much, Jonathan. Great presentation.
Thank you.
And Kali Roy, if you can put the last notice we have and tell us about what is else coming up on the Global Clinical Engineering Alliance program. The flyer is describing the biannual International Clinical Engineering and Health Technology Management Congress that from person to person, we are doing virtual person to person, and it will be on October 24th through the 26th with a full 5 days in advance of that of Global Clinical Engineering Week activity starting with China. So Kali, please.
On behalf of GCEA, I would also like to thank Jonathan for a very, very informative webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A list of additional topics and dates for the next 6 webinars will be soon published on our website, globalcea.org. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Jonathan, there's a question about software for project management, if you can take that. If not,
yes, I responded to the question, and the software I recommended are, I can put that in the chat also.
Great.
I'll do that now.
Great. And thank you, Bruce, for correcting the spelling on Sonic and for your comments. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.